The year is 1840, deep in the isolated hollers of Appalachian Virginia, where civilization's rules don't reach and older, darker customs still hold sway. 16-year-old Clara Whitmore arrives at her uncle's remote mountain homestead after her parents' sudden death, only to discover that she's been brought there for a reason far more sinister than family charity. Every autumn, when the leaves turn blood red and the mist crawls up from the valleys, the mountain families gather for what they call the choosing, a secret tradition where young women are auctioned to the highest bidder under the guise of arranged marriages. But this is no ordinary marriage market. The men who bid aren't looking for wives. They're looking for something else entirely, something connected to an ancient pact made generations ago with whatever dwells in the deepest parts of these mountains. As Clara uncovers the horrifying truth about why certain girls are chosen and what really happens to them after the auction, she realizes that escaping might be impossible because the mountains themselves won't let her leave. And the man who wins her bid isn't even human anymore. The wagon hit another rut, and Clara Whitmore's head cracked against the wooden side rail hard enough to make her vision spark. She didn't cry out. Hadn't cried since the fever took her parents 3 weeks ago. Hadn't spoken much either. Just signed the papers the county man put in front of her, and climbed into this wagon with a driver who hadn't said 10 words since they left Lexington. The October air had teeth this far into the mountains, and the trees pressed close on both sides of the trail, like they were trying to swallow the path entirely. Clara pulled her mother's shawl tighter and watched the sunlight die between the branches overhead. They'd been climbing since dawn, and the world had gotten progressively stranger with each mile. The settlements farther apart, the few people they passed more hollow-eyed and suspicious, until there were no settlements at all. Just this endless tunnel of red and gold leaves that whispered secrets she couldn't quite hear. The driver finally spoke as they rounded a bend and a clearing opened before them. "Whitmore Place," he said, and his voice carried something that might have been pity or might have been relief that his job was done. "I'll be leaving you here." Clara looked at what would apparently be her new home and felt something cold settle in her stomach. That had nothing to do with the mountain air. The homestead crouched in the clearing like something that had grown there rather than been built. All dark wood and odd angles that didn't quite make sense when you looked at them too long. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and somewhere nearby she could hear water running. Probably the creek her mother had mentioned once or twice in stories about growing up in these mountains before she'd married Clara's father and moved to civilization. A woman stood on the porch, watching them approach with an expression Clara couldn't read. Too young to be Uncle Silas's wife, maybe a daughter, though her mother had never mentioned cousins. The driver pulled the wagon to a stop and didn't offer to help Clara down, just handed her the small trunk that contained everything she owned now, and turned the horses around before she'd even gotten her footing on the muddy ground. She watched him disappear back into the trees with a speed that suggested he couldn't leave fast enough. And then she was alone in the clearing, with the strange house and the watching woman, and the sound of wind moving through the hollow in a way that sounded almost like voices. "You'll be Clara then," the woman called from the porch, and there was something off about her voice too, something flat and effectless that made Clara's skin prickle. "I'm Ruth, your cousin, though I suppose we've never met. Father's inside. He's been expecting you." Clara picked up her trunk and crossed the clearing, her boots squelching in mud that seemed too red, too dark, like the earth here was different than regular earth. Ruth watched her come with eyes that were the palest blue Clara had ever seen, almost colorless. And she didn't move to help or welcome or do any of the things family was supposed to do when receiving a newly orphaned girl. She just stood there with her hands folded at her waist, wearing a dress that might have been fashionable 20 years ago. And when Clara got close enough, she could see that Ruth's face, though young, had a quality about it like a mask, like something pretending to be a person, but not quite getting the details right. "I'm sorry about your folks," Ruth said, but there was no sorry in her voice at all. "Fever's a hard way to go, but you're here now, and that's what matters." Father says blood calls to blood in these mountains. Says you were always meant to come back. Clara wanted to say that she'd never been here before, that her mother had left these mountains pregnant and sworn never to return, that this wasn't coming back, but being sent somewhere foreign and frightening, but the words stuck in her throat. There was something about the way Ruth looked at her, something hungry and sad at the same time, that made Clara think speaking might be dangerous somehow. So she just nodded and followed Ruth into the house, into the dimness that smelled like wood smoke and something else, something organic and slightly rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. The inside of the house was somehow worse than the outside. The rooms were too dark despite the windows, the corners too deep, and everywhere Clara looked there were odd things hanging on the walls, bundles of dried plants she didn't recognize, symbols carved into the wooden beams overhead, and what looked disturbingly like small bones arranged in patterns above the doorways. Uncle Silas sat in a chair by the fire, and when he turned to look at her, Clara understood immediately why her mother had left and never come back. His face was lean and weathered like old leather, but his eyes were the same pale nothing color as Ruth's, and when he smiled, it didn't reach those eyes at all. Just pulled his lips back from teeth that seemed slightly too many in his mouth. "There's the girl," he said, and his voice had that same flatness as Ruth's. Like emotion was something he'd heard about but never actually experienced. "You look like your mother did at that age." "Same dark hair, same build." "That's good. That's real good." He gestured to a chair across from him, and Clara sat because her legs suddenly felt unreliable, and she had the distinct sense that refusing would be worse than complying. "I expect you're confused about why you're here," Silas continued, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "County sent you because I'm bloodkin, because that's the law when a child's orphaned, but the truth is deeper than that. Your mother ran from what she was meant for, married outside the mountains, thought she could escape what's owed. But blood calls to blood, Clara. The mountains don't forget, and debts don't die just because someone runs away. You're 16 now, same age your mother was when she left, and that means you're old enough to fulfill what she abandoned." Clara found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than she wanted. "I don't understand. What debt?" "What are you talking about?" Silas and Ruth exchanged a look, and something passed between them that Clara couldn't interpret. Some shared knowledge that made Ruth's mask face flicker with what might have been sympathy or might have been something worse. "You'll understand soon enough," Silas said. "The choosing is 3 weeks away on the October moon, same as it's been for 100 years. You'll be prepared proper, taught what you need to know, and then you'll take your place like you were always meant to. Like your mother was meant to before she broke faith and ran." The cold in Clara's stomach spread to her limbs, making her fingers numb where they gripped the arms of the chair. "What choosing? I don't want to be chosen for anything. I just want—" But she didn't know how to finish that sentence because what she wanted was impossible. Her parents alive, her old life back, anywhere but this dark house, in these pressing mountains, with these wrong-faced people who claimed to be family. "What you want, don't figure into it," Silas said. And now there was something hard in his voice, something that suggested questioning was a mistake she shouldn't make twice. "You're here, and here you'll stay until the choosing, and then you'll go where you're bid for, and that's the end of it. Ruth will show you to your room and explain what needs explaining. Best you learn quick that fighting what's meant to be only makes it harder on yourself." He turned back to the fire then, dismissing her like she'd already ceased to matter. And Ruth touched Clara's elbow with cold fingers and led her toward a narrow staircase at the back of the house. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the second floor was even darker than the first, a hallway lined with closed doors that Clara somehow knew she shouldn't open. Ruth led her to the last door on the left and pushed it open to reveal a small room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the clearing toward the darkening trees. "This was your mother's room," Ruth said quietly, and for the first time there was something almost human in her voice, something that might have been genuine sadness. "She slept here until she ran away the night before her choosing." Father was furious, but there was nothing to be done. The mountains won't take a bride who's already fled. And by the time he tracked her, she was already married to your father and pregnant with you. He thought the debt was cancelled, that the mountains would forget. But they didn't forget, Clara. They never forget. They've been waiting for you. Clara turned to look at Ruth properly for the first time, really look at her, and what she saw made her breath catch. Beneath the mask-like quality of Ruth's face, there were signs of something Clara had missed before, a tremor in her hands that never quite stopped, a slight disconnect in how her eyes tracked movement. And when she smiled, it was with the empty, automatic quality of someone who'd learned to mimic the expression, but no longer remembered what it felt like. "What happened to you?" Clara whispered. "You were in a choosing too, weren't you?" Ruth's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went very far away. 3 years ago," she said. "I was prepared same as you'll be, put on the auction block same as you'll be, and all the men bid on me like I was a prize heifer at the county fair. But when it came time for the final bid, something went wrong. The man who'd been favored to win, he looked at me and said I wasn't right, said something was off in my blood, and he withdrew his bid. Everyone withdrew their bids. I wasn't chosen, Clara, and that's worse than being chosen, do you understand? The mountains don't like being refused. They take it personal. So I got to come home, got to stay with Father, but I'm not really here anymore. Part of me is still on that auction block waiting to be wanted, and part of me is somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, where the mountain keeps the things it's angry at. That's what happens when you're prepared and then rejected. You become stuck between neither here nor there, neither alive nor dead, just waiting forever for something that'll never come." She said it all in that same flat voice, like she was reciting a recipe or describing the weather. And Clara realized with horror that Ruth wasn't wearing a mask at all, that the wrongness in her face and voice was damage, was what happened when something broke inside a person and couldn't be fixed. "I won't let that happen to me," Clara said. And she was surprised by the strength in her own voice, the certainty. "I'll run like my mother did. I'll leave tonight and—" But Ruth was shaking her head, and the sadness in her broken face deepened. "You can't run. The mountains won't let you. Your mother could run because she fled before the choosing, before she was prepared and marked for the ceremony. But you're here now, and Father will make sure you're prepared proper, and once that's done, you belong to the mountains whether you want to or not. The only way out is through, Clara. You'll be chosen or you'll be rejected, but you won't be leaving. The mountains have been waiting 16 years for you. They won't let you go easy." She left then, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded horribly final. And Clara was alone in her mother's childhood room, with darkness gathering outside the window and the weight of something vast and hungry pressing down on the house from the mountains all around. She went to the window and looked out at the tree line, at the way shadows moved between the trunks in patterns that didn't match the wind, and she understood with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct that Ruth was right. She could feel it now that she was paying attention, a presence in the mountains themselves, something old and patient and utterly implacable, something that had been waiting for her since before she was born. The mountains were watching her, the mountains were hungry, and in 3 weeks, when the October moon rose full over this cursed hollow, Clara would learn exactly what they hungered for. Clara didn't sleep that first night. She lay in her mother's old bed listening to the house settle and creak around her, listening to footsteps in the hall that would pause outside her door and then move on, listening to voices downstairs that were too low to make out words, but carried a rhythm that sounded like chanting. When dawn finally came grey and cold through the window, she rose stiff and exhausted, and found a dress laid out on the chair that hadn't been there when she'd finally closed her eyes for a moment. It was old-fashioned even by mountain standards, high-necked and long-sleeved, made of fabric that felt strange under her fingers, almost slippery, almost alive. She didn't want to put it on, but her own clothes from the trunk were gone, searched through during the night probably, and the dress was all there was. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her measurements exactly, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the girl looking back. She looked like she belonged here now, like she'd already started becoming whatever it was these mountains wanted her to be. The smell of cooking drew her downstairs, where she found Ruth at the stove and Silas already seated at a rough wooden table. They didn't greet her, just gestured to a place set with a tin plate and cup, and Clara sat because her stomach was empty, even if the thought of eating in this house made her feel sick. The food was plain, cornmeal mush and salt pork, but it was hot, and her body needed it, regardless of what her mind thought. So she ate in silence, while Silas watched her with those pale, empty eyes. When she'd finished, Ruth cleared the plates without a word, and Silas stood, reaching for a coat hung by the door. "You'll come with me this morning," he said, not asking, just stating fact. "There's things you need to see, things you need to understand before the preparation begins, proper tomorrow. Ruth, you'll start gathering what's needed for the first ritual." "We're already behind schedule thanks to the delay in getting her here." Ruth nodded, that same mechanical gesture that suggested her body moved independent of any real will. And Clara followed Silas out into the cold morning air. Mist hung thick in the hollow, turning the trees into ghost shapes and muffling sound in a way that made Clara feel like they'd stepped outside the normal world into someplace else entirely. Silas walked with the confidence of someone who knew every root and rock, leading her along a narrow path that wound behind the house and up the slope into the trees. Clara tried to mark the way, tried to memorize landmarks in case she needed to run, despite what Ruth had said. But the mist made everything strange, and the trees all looked the same, vast and old and somehow aware. They climbed for perhaps 20 minutes, Silas never slowing or looking back to see if she was keeping pace. And then the path opened into another small clearing, and Clara stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. The clearing was full of graves. Dozens of them, maybe more, simple wooden markers in uneven rows, some so old the wood had rotted nearly to nothing, others newer, the carved names still legible. Clara moved forward as if pulled, reading the markers that were clear enough to read, and a pattern emerged that made her skin go cold, despite the exertion of the climb. Sarah Mills, age 16, October 1789. Elizabeth Crane, age 17, October 1795. Martha Blackwood, age 16, October 1803, on and on. All women, all young, all died in October, going back more than a century to the oldest markers she could find. Some had surnames she recognized from her mother's stories about mountain families. Others were unfamiliar, but the pattern was unmistakable and utterly horrifying. "These are the chosen ones," Silas said from behind her, his voice carrying no particular emotion, just stating a fact like he might comment on the weather. "Every girl who went through the choosing and was bid for proper. They serve their purpose, and then they're laid to rest here in the choosing ground. It's an honor, being buried here. Means you fulfilled what you were meant for. Means the mountains accepted your offering." Clara turned to face him, and she could feel something rising in her chest. Something that was part terror and part rage and part disbelief that this could be real. That she could be standing in a graveyard full of murdered girls while her uncle talked about honor. "You're insane," she said, and her voice shook, but she kept it steady as she could. "All of you, this whole place, it's insane. These are children. Someone killed these girls and buried them here, and you're talking about it like it's something holy, something right. But it's murder. It's just murder, dressed up in mountain superstition and old customs that should have died 100 years ago." She expected anger, expected him to strike her or drag her back to the house. But Silas just looked at her with something that might have been amusement in a person capable of normal human emotion. "You think this is murder," he said slowly, like explaining something to a particularly dim child. "You think we're just mountain folk killing girls for no reason, like we're savages or devils. But you don't understand what these mountains are, Clara. You don't understand what lives in them. What's always lived in them, long before any white settler came here. Long before the Cherokee themselves settled these valleys. There's something old here, something that was here when the world was young, and it has appetites that need feeding. Your great-great-great-grandfather, Tobias Whitmore, learned that in 1740, when he and the other founders tried to settle this hollow. The first winter killed half of them, disease and cold and accidents that weren't really accidents. The second winter would have killed the rest, but old Tobias made a pact. He went up into the high places, where the air gets thin and the trees grow twisted, and he made an offering to what dwells there, and he struck a bargain. The mountains would let the families stay, would let them prosper even. But every October, when the veil gets thin and the old things wake hungry, we'd give them what they wanted. A girl, young and unmarried and prepared according to the old ways that Tobias learned up there in the high places. A bride for the mountain, that's what the men call it, though what happens to the girls isn't really marriage as you'd understand it. It's transformation, it's sacrifice, it's feeding something that's neither alive nor dead, but somewhere in between. And it keeps the rest of us safe. Keeps the crops growing, and the game plentiful, and the winters survivable. That's the pact, and it's held for 100 years. And you're not going to break it with your city notions of murder and justice. Clara wanted to run then. Wanted to bolt down the mountain and keep running until she hit civilization again, but her legs wouldn't move. Rooted to the ground among all these graves of girls who'd stood where she stood and probably felt what she felt and ended up in the ground anyway. My mother broke it, she said desperately. She ran and nothing happened. No curse, no mountain revenge. She lived a normal life but Silas was shaking his head, and the almost smile on his face made Clara's stomach turn. Your mother was punished, just not the way you think. The fever that took her and your father, you think that was natural. You think it was coincidence that it hit them both so sudden, so severe, right when you turned 16 and the debt came due. The mountains don't forget, Clara, and they always collect. Your mother thought she'd escaped, but all she did was buy herself time. The debt transferred to you the moment you were born, and the mountains waited patient for you to come of age. They killed your parents to bring you here, to force you into the only hands that could deliver you to the choosing ground. You think you're orphaned by bad luck, but you're orphaned by design, by cosmic design, by something so much older and hungrier than you can imagine. The mist seemed to press closer as he spoke, and Clara could swear the trees had moved when she wasn't looking. The clearing smaller now, more enclosed, like the forest was slowly digesting them. She looked at the graves again, at all those names and dates, and she tried to imagine what her marker would say. Clara Whitmore, age 16, October 1840. Another girl who thought she could fight and learned too late that some things are inevitable as the seasons. What happens to them? She asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how defeated. But she needed to know, needed to understand what waited for her in 3 weeks. The girls who are chosen, what actually happens. Silas tilted his head, considering, and for a moment his face did something strange, the flesh seeming to ripple like water, and Clara wondered if he was even fully human anymore, or if living this close to the mountain's hunger had changed him into something else. They're bid on, he said. Auction style, like the title says, though it's not really about money. The men bid with offerings, with promises, with pieces of themselves. The one who bids highest, who offers the most to the mountain, he wins the girl and takes her to his cabin for the consummation. That's where the real ritual happens, where the girl becomes the bridge between our world and what's underneath it. The man, he's not really a man anymore by that point. He's more like a vessel, something the mountain wears like a coat to interact with our world. And the girl, she opens herself up, willingly or not, and the mountain feeds through her, takes what it needs. And when it's done, there's nothing left but a shell that looks like a girl, but isn't, not anymore. The body gets buried here with the others, but what was inside, the soul or spirit or whatever you want to call it, that goes down into the deep places, becomes part of the mountain's dreaming, forever. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was describing how to churn butter or plow a field, and that casual horror was somehow worse than if he'd been ranting or gleeful. This was just normal to him, just the way things worked in this hollow. And the fact that he could see nothing wrong with it made Clara understand that there was no appealing to his humanity, no way to make him see reason, because whatever made people human had been leached out of him by years of complicity in this nightmare. "There are others," she said, grasping at straws now at anything that might give her leverage or information. "Ruth said there would be other girls being prepared? Where are they? Can I meet them?" Something flickered across Silas's face, not quite satisfaction, but close. "Smart question. Yes, there are 3 others this year. 4 brides for 4 families, that's how it works. The Cranes, the Blackwoods, the Mills, and us Whitmores, we're the founding families, the ones who were here when the pact was made, and each family provides a girl when their turn comes around. Sometimes it's daughters, sometimes nieces or cousins, but it's always family blood, always the right age, and always prepared according to the proper forms. You'll meet the other girls tomorrow when the preparations begin. They've been here longer than you, they understand their duty, and they'll help you understand yours. Or at least they'll help you accept it, which amounts to the same thing in the end." He turned then and started back down the path, and Clara had no choice but to follow, though she looked back once at the graveyard and tried to memorize it, tried to hold on to the reality of all those dead girls, so she wouldn't forget what was waiting for her if she couldn't find a way out. The walk back seemed shorter, or maybe Clara's sense of time had fractured, but suddenly they were back at the house and Ruth was waiting on the porch with that same empty smile. "Get some rest," Silas said, already moving past her toward the door. "Tomorrow the real work begins, and you'll need your strength. The preparation rituals aren't easy, and fighting them only makes them hurt more. Ask Ruth if you don't believe me." Ruth's smile didn't change, but something in her pale eyes went distant and dark, and Clara knew without asking that fighting was exactly what Ruth had done, and the brokenness in her was the result. Clara spent the rest of that day in her room, sitting by the window and watching the mountains as the sun tracked across the sky and shadows moved in the trees with that same wrong motion that didn't match the wind. She tried to think of escape plans, tried to logic her way through the situation, but every scenario ended with her lost in the endless forest, or dragged back to the house by men who weren't quite men anymore. By the time darkness fell, she'd convinced herself that her only chance was to learn everything she could, to understand the ritual and the pact and find some weakness in it, some way to break the cycle that didn't involve just running blind into the mountains. Her mother had run, and it had bought her years, but not freedom, not really, because the debt had just transferred to Clara. But maybe there was another way. Maybe if Clara was smart and careful and willing to do what her mother hadn't, maybe she could find a way to end this that didn't involve her body in that graveyard by October's end. It was a thin hope, barely more than a wish, but it was all she had as she lay down in her mother's bed and waited for the next day to come, waited for the preparation to begin, waited to meet the other girls who'd been chosen by their families and delivered to the mountain's hunger, like Clara herself had been delivered. Outside her window, the mountains watched and waited with the patience of things that measure time in centuries rather than years. And somewhere in the deep places where light never reached, something ancient and vast stirred in its dreaming and tasted Clara's fear on the October air and found it delicious. Morning came with Ruth's cold hand on Clara's shoulder, shaking her awake before dawn had fully broken. Clara's dreams had been full of graves and hollow-eyed men, and something vast moving beneath the mountain like a heartbeat. And waking was almost a relief, except for the fact that waking meant facing whatever preparation Silas had promised. Ruth stood over her in the grey light, holding a bundle of cloth and a wooden bowl that steamed with something that smelled of herbs and something else, something bitter and organic that made Clara's stomach clench. "Time to begin," Ruth said in that flat voice. "The other girls are already at the preparation house. You'll bathe first, wash away the outside world, and then we'll mark you proper so the mountain knows you're offered willing." Clara wanted to say she wasn't willing, that nothing about this was willing, but the look in Ruth's damaged eyes suggested that the distinction didn't matter, that willing was something that would be extracted from her whether she felt it or not. She took the bundle and found a shift made of the same strange fabric as the dress, white and thin enough to be almost transparent, and when she touched it, the fabric seemed to warm under her fingers like it had body heat of its own. "Put it on," Ruth instructed. "Nothing else, no undergarments, nothing from before. You're being born into this now, and birth happens naked." Clara dressed with her back to Ruth, trying to maintain some scrap of dignity, but she could feel Ruth's eyes on her anyway, assessing, comparing, seeing something Clara couldn't see yet. When she turned around, Ruth nodded once and handed her the wooden bowl. "Drink half now, the rest after the marking. It'll make things easier. Blur the edges where it hurts. Don't ask what's in it, because knowing makes it harder to swallow." Clara looked at the steaming liquid, dark and viscous with bits of plant matter floating in it, and every instinct screamed not to drink. But Ruth was already moving toward the door, and Clara understood that refusal wasn't an option. Not if she wanted to learn what she needed to learn, not if she wanted any chance of finding a way through this. She lifted the bowl to her lips and drank, and the taste was worse than the smell, bitter and rotten sweet at the same time, coating her throat with something oily that made her gag. But she kept it down, forced herself to swallow half like Ruth had instructed, and within moments she felt something shift in her perception, the edges of the room going soft, colors bleeding slightly beyond their normal boundaries, and a strange calm settling over her fear like a blanket over fire, smothering but not extinguishing. Ruth led her outside into the pre-dawn cold, and Clara was barefoot on the ground but couldn't quite feel it properly, like there was a layer of cotton between her feet and the earth. They walked a different path than yesterday, this one leading away from the graveyard and toward a structure Clara hadn't noticed before. A small building set back in the trees that looked older than the house, older than any building should look and still be standing. The wood was dark with age and weather, and symbols were carved into every surface. The same symbols Clara had seen in the main house, but more elaborate here, more deliberate, forming patterns that hurt to look at if you tried to follow them too long. Ruth opened the door without knocking and pushed Clara gently inside, and the calm from the drink was the only thing that kept Clara from bolting when she saw what waited. The interior was a single large room, lit by candles that burned with flames too blue to be natural, and the air was thick with smoke from bundles of herbs burning in clay pots. 3 other girls stood in a circle in the center of the room, all wearing the same white shifts, all with their hair loose around their shoulders, and all looking at Clara with expressions that ranged from resigned to terrified, to something that might have been drugged peace. An old woman tended the herb pots, older than anyone Clara had ever seen, her face so creased with wrinkles it was hard to find her actual features. But her eyes were sharp and clear, and the same pale nothing color that marked Silas and Ruth, and probably everyone in this hollow who'd lived close to the mountains for too long. "The Whitmore girl," the old woman said, and her voice was surprisingly strong, surprisingly warm, like a grandmother's voice if grandmothers prepared children for ritual sacrifice. "We've been waiting, child. You're the last piece, the final bride. Come join your sisters and we'll begin the marking." Clara moved forward because her feet carried her forward, the drug making her compliant even as her mind screamed, and she took her place in the circle with the 3 other girls. Up close, she could see they were all around her age, 16 or 17, all with the same hollow look in their eyes that came from understanding something horrible and having no power to change it. The girl to her left had red hair and freckles and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The girl across from her was darker, maybe Cherokee blood mixed in, and she stared at the floor like she could drill through it with her gaze and escape into the earth. The girl to her right was blonde and pretty in a fragile way, and when she looked at Clara, there was something like apology in her face. "I'm Emma Crane," the blonde girl whispered, barely audible over the crackling of the herb fires. "That's Lucy Blackwood and Ann Mills. We've been here for a week already, going through the preparations. It's not as bad as you think, or maybe it's worse. I can't tell anymore. The drink helps. Let the drink help. Before Clara could respond, the old woman began moving around the circle, chanting something in a language that wasn't English and might not have been any human language at all, just sounds that approximated words. And with each pass around the circle, she drew symbols on each girl's forehead with what looked like charcoal, but smelled like blood. When she came to Clara, the old woman paused, studying her face with an intensity that made Clara want to look away but couldn't, because the pale eyes held her locked. "You have your mother's look," the old woman said, still in that warm grandmother voice that made everything worse because it suggested kindness where there was none. "Sarah was a strong girl, fought hard against her fate, and I see that same fight in you. But strength won't save you here, child. The mountain doesn't care about strength except as seasoning. What it wants is surrender, transformation, the willing dissolution of self into something greater. You'll learn that in time, or you'll break like young Ruth broke. And either way, the mountain gets what it wants in the end." She marked Clara's forehead, and the substance burned cold rather than hot, sinking into Clara's skin like it was being absorbed. And the moment the symbol was complete, Clara felt something shift fundamentally, felt a door open somewhere inside her that she hadn't known existed. And through that door came a whisper that might have been the mountain, or might have been her own fear, but felt like neither. Felt like something other trying on her consciousness, like someone trying on a coat. The old woman moved to the center of the circle and raised her arms, and the blue flames in the candles rose higher, casting shadows that moved wrong on the walls. "You four are chosen," she intoned, and the words had a weight that went beyond sound, seemed to press down on Clara's shoulders like physical force. 4 families, 4 bloodlines, 4 debts paid forward from 100 years of prosperity bought with sacrifice. Tomorrow, we begin the 3 weeks of preparation proper. You'll learn the chants that open the way, the movements that invite the sacred in, the meditations that hollow you out so you can be filled with purpose. You'll be bathed in waters from the deep springs where the mountain's power runs strongest. You'll fast and feast in cycles that break down your resistance and rebuild you as vessels. And on the October moon, when the veil thins and the old powers wake fully, you'll be led to the choosing ground where the men will bid for you, and the highest bidders will take you to their cabins for the consummation. And what happens after that is between you and the mountain and the deep dreaming that never ends. Lucy Blackwood made a sound then, something between a sob and a laugh, and when Clara looked at her, she saw that Lucy's eyes had gone empty, like something inside her had. Finally broken under the weight of understanding, Ann Mills just kept staring at the floor, and Emma Crane reached out and took Clara's hand, squeezing it with desperate strength. And Clara squeezed back, because what else was there to do in the face of this madness, except hold on to another person for as long as you could? The rest of that first day blurred together in a haze of ritual and repetition. The old woman, whose name was apparently Grandmother Vess, though Clara suspected she was grandmother to no one, and the title was ceremonial, taught them chants in that not-quite language, had them repeat the sounds until their throats were raw and the words started to feel like they meant something, even though Clara's rational mind insisted they were just nonsense. Between chants, they were made to drink more of the bitter tea, and each dose made the world a little less solid, a little more dreamlike, until Clara couldn't quite remember if she'd been here for hours or days, and the boundaries between herself and the other girls started to feel permeable. Emma kept trying to whisper to her during the brief moments when Grandmother Vess left the room to tend to something outside. Kept trying to tell her things that might have been warnings or might have been explanations. But the words didn't stick in Clara's drugged mind, slid away like water on glass. What Clara did understand, what came through despite the haze, was that Emma had a plan, or thought she had a plan. Something about the night of the choosing. Something about the moment between the bidding and the taking, when the girls were transferred from their families to their buyers, "That's when the leash is loosest," Emma whispered urgently, her fingers digging into Clara's arm. "That's when we run, all four of us together, because the mountain can't hold all of us if we scatter in different directions. One or two might make it, might get far enough away that the pact breaks. And if even one of us escapes, then maybe the whole system falls apart. Maybe the mountain starves and the families are forced to find another way." It sounded desperate and impossible, but Clara clung to it anyway, because impossible hope was better than certain doom. And she nodded to show she understood, even though she wasn't sure she did, even though the drug made everything feel equally real and equally unreal. The sun had set by the time Grandmother Vess finally allowed them to stop, and Ruth appeared at the door to collect Clara and lead her back to the main house. Clara's legs were unsteady and her mind was swimming, but she could feel the symbol on her forehead like a brand, even though when she touched it, there was nothing there but smooth skin. The door inside her, the one the marking had opened, was still ajar, and through it, she could feel something vast paying attention to her now in a way it hadn't before. Could feel the mountain's awareness settling on her like the weight of deep water. Silas was waiting when they got back to the house, sitting in his chair by the fire, exactly as he'd been the first night, and he looked at Clara with something that might have been satisfaction. "How was the first day?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I can see the mark took proper. You're in the system now, registered with the mountain's hunger. 3 more weeks of preparation, and you'll be ready for the choosing. The men are already starting to gather, coming down from the high places and up from the deep valleys, all the old families who participate in the witnessing. It'll be quite the event this year, 4 brides at once. Hasn't been a 4-bride choosing in near 20 years. Clara wanted to spit at him, wanted to rage, but the drug made everything distant, and the open door in her mind made her feel watched from within. So she just stood there, swaying slightly, until Ruth took her arm and guided her upstairs. That night, Clara dreamed she was walking through the graveyard of chosen girls. But instead of wooden markers, the graves had mirrors. And in each mirror, she saw herself at different ages. Different stages of life she'd never live. Children she'd never have. Grey hair she'd never grow. All the futures that had been stolen by the pact her ancestors made 100 years ago. And in the dream, the mountain spoke to her, not in words, but in feelings, in certainties that bypassed language. And it told her that running was pointless, that Emma's plan would fail because the mountain had heard it through the open door in Emma's own mind, that all 4 girls were already claimed, and the only question was which man would win each one, not whether the claiming itself would happen. When Clara woke, she was crying, tears running down her face into her hair, and she couldn't remember if the dream had been dream or vision or memory of something that hadn't happened yet, but would, inevitably. The way October follows September, and death follows life in these mountains, where time moved circular instead of forward, and the past was always present, always hungry, always taking what it was owed. 3 weeks suddenly felt like no time at all. And Clara understood with sick certainty that she was running out of moments to be herself, that each ritual and each dose of the tea was filing her down, smoothing away her edges, making her into something that would fit through the door when the choosing came. And she didn't know if there would be enough of her left by then to even want to run, or if Emma's desperate plan would matter when they were all finally just hollow vessels, waiting to be filled with the mountain's dreaming. But she held on to it anyway, held on to the possibility of escape, like a drowning person holds on to driftwood, knowing it might not save her but needing to hold something, needing to believe that the story could end differently than it had for all those girls in the graveyard, even though the mountain's certainty sat in her chest like a stone and whispered otherwise every time her heart beat. The days blurred into each other after that first preparation session, each morning beginning with Ruth's cold hand and the bitter tea, each day spent in the preparation house with Grandmother Vess and the other girls, learning things that Clara's mind tried to reject, but her drugged body absorbed anyway. The chants became easier. The strange movements, almost natural, and that terrified her more than the difficulty had because it meant she was adapting. Meant some part of her was accepting this as normal. By the end of the first week, Clara could feel the mountain's presence constantly now, not just through the door in her mind, but all around her. In the air she breathed, and the water she drank, and the ground beneath her feet. It watched her with something that felt almost like affection, the way a farmer might watch a crop he was raising for harvest. And the worst part was that some small, traitorous part of Clara had started to find comfort in that attention, had started to crave the certainty of being wanted, even if what wanted her was monstrous. Emma still whispered about escape during the brief moments when Grandmother Vess's attention wandered, but her whispers had grown more frantic and less coherent, and Lucy Blackwood had stopped responding to anything at all, just moved through the rituals like a sleepwalker. And Anne Mills had started laughing at random moments, high and brittle sounds that suggested something in her had cracked beyond repair. On the 8th day, Silas came to the preparation house himself, something Grandmother Vess seemed surprised by, and he brought with him a book so old the leather binding was nearly black with age, and the pages were brittle as dried leaves. He set it on the floor in the center of their circle and opened it to a page marked with what looked disturbingly like a preserved finger, and Clara saw that the text was handwritten in faded ink, the script old-fashioned and hard to read, but definitely English. "This is Tobias Whitmore's journal," Silas said, his voice carrying a reverence Clara hadn't heard from him before. "My great-great-great-grandfather, the one who made the pact. Grandmother Vess thought it was time you girls understood the history proper, understood what you're part of, and why it matters. This isn't just some savage tradition, isn't just mountain folk being backwards. What Tobias discovered in these mountains, what he bargained with, it's older than human civilization. Older than the Cherokee who were here before us, older than anything that has a name in any language still spoken. I'm going to read you the relevant passages, and you're going to understand that what happens to you isn't cruelty, it's necessity. It's the price of survival in a world that has things in it that most people never see and wouldn't believe if they did." He began to read, and his voice took on a different quality, became deeper and more resonant. And Clara realized he was reading not just with his voice, but with something else, channeling something through the words that made them more than words, made them almost alive. The journal entry was dated October 1740, and it told a story that Clara wished desperately she didn't have to hear, but couldn't stop listening to, because the drug and the symbols and the weeks of preparation had opened her up too much, made her too receptive, and the story poured into her like water into a cracked vessel. Tobias Whitmore had come to these mountains with 3 other families in the spring of 1739, seeking land and independence from the coastal settlements where religious and social pressures made life difficult for those who thought differently. They'd found this hollow by chance or fate, found it empty and fertile, with a creek that ran year-round and game so plentiful it seemed impossible. They'd built their homes and planted their crops and prepared for winter, with the confidence of men who'd survived harsh conditions before. But the first winter had been catastrophic in ways that had nothing to do with weather. People had started dying, not from cold or hunger, but from accidents that weren't accidents, from sicknesses that came on sudden and strange, from simple bad luck that compounded and multiplied until half the settlement was dead by spring. The survivors had been ready to abandon the hollow, but Tobias had refused, had insisted there was something in the mountains that was causing their troubles, something that needed to be understood rather than fled from. He'd started exploring, going deeper into the high places than anyone else dared, and in a cave system on the north face of the highest peak, he'd found something. The journal didn't describe it directly, just called it the sleeper, the old one, the thing beneath, and said it was vast beyond comprehension and dreaming dreams that leaked into reality like poison into water. It had been there since before the mountains rose, Tobias wrote, since before the world had the shape it had now. And it slept most of the time, but its sleep was restless and its dreams were hungry. And everything in the hollow suffered from proximity to those dreams, whether they knew it or not. Tobias had done something incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on perspective. And he'd gone into the deep places where the sleeper dwelled, and he'd made contact somehow, through methods the journal didn't detail, but suggested involved blood and pain, and the sacrifice of something essential. And the sleeper had acknowledged him, had spoken to him in ways that weren't words, but were understood anyway. And it had offered a bargain. The families could stay, could prosper even, but they would owe a debt, would pay a tithe each year when the sleeper's dreaming was closest to the surface, when the October moon rose full and the veil between sleeping and waking grew thin. A girl, Tobias wrote, young and pure, and properly prepared according to instructions the sleeper had transmitted directly into his mind. The girl would be offered to one of the men of the founding families, but the man wouldn't really be a man anymore by the time of the offering, would be a vessel for something else. Something that would use his form to interact with the girl in ways that would open a channel between the sleeper's dreaming and the waking world. Through that channel the sleeper would feed, would draw sustenance from the girl's terror and pain and eventual dissolution, and in exchange it would keep its dreams from leaking into the settlement, would contain its hunger to just the one sacrifice and leave the rest of the families in peace. It was a horrible bargain, Tobias acknowledged in his journal, but it was survival, and survival sometimes demanded horrible things. The other families had agreed, desperate and scared, and willing to accept any terms that would let them stay in the hollow they'd already invested so much in. And that first October they'd offered Tobias his own daughter, a girl named Mercy, who was 16 and beautiful, and who Tobias wrote about with love and anguish and ultimately cold necessity. Silas turned the pages carefully, showing the girls an entry dated October 15th, 1740, written in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, less controlled. Tobias described the ritual in detail that made Clara's stomach heave, despite the calming effects of the tea. Mercy had been prepared for 3 weeks, exactly as the girls were being prepared now, drugged and marked, and taught to open herself to the sleeper's influence. On the night of the full moon, she'd been brought to a clearing, the same clearing where the graveyard now stood, and the men of the 4 families had gathered to bid on her with offerings they'd spent weeks preparing. Offerings of their own blood and breath and pieces of their souls that they cut away and presented like gifts. A man named Ezekiel Crane had won the bidding, offering the most, and he'd taken Mercy to a cabin prepared for the purpose, and there the consummation had occurred. Though Tobias's description made it clear that what happened wasn't sexual in any normal sense, but something far stranger, a merging of flesh and spirit and dream that lasted through the night and into the dawn. By morning, Mercy was dead, or what remained of her body was dead, though Tobias wrote that he could still feel her somewhere in the mountains. Could sense her consciousness dissolved into the sleeper's greater awareness, part of its dreaming now and forever. The other family's crops had flourished that next year. Game had been abundant. No one had died of accidents or strange sicknesses, and Tobias had known the pact was sealed. Every October since then, one of the 4 families provided a girl, rotating through the generations, and every October the ritual was performed exactly as the sleeper had instructed. And every October the hollow remained prosperous, while the girls became part of the mountain's hunger. Silas closed the journal and looked at the 4 girls in the circle, and there was something almost like sympathy in his pale eyes. Though it was sympathy that wouldn't change anything, wouldn't save them. "You're not being murdered," he said quietly. "You're being transformed. You're becoming part of something vast and eternal, part of the mountain's consciousness. And yes, it requires your death in the flesh, but it's also a kind of immortality, isn't it? Every girl who's been chosen, she's still here in a sense, still aware, still part of the sleeper's dreaming. You'll never truly die, Clara, Emma, Lucy, Anne. You'll just stop being individuals and start being part of something greater. Most people die and disappear completely, but you four, you'll live forever in the mountain's memory, in its dreams, feeding it and being fed by it in a cycle that never ends. That's not nothing. That's more than most people get. Emma made a sound then, wordless and anguished, and Clara saw that whatever hope Emma had been holding on to, whatever desperate plan she'd been nurturing, the journal had killed it, had made her understand the impossibility of fighting something this old, this vast, this fundamentally other. Lucy didn't react at all, had gone so far into herself that Clara wondered if she was even still in her body, or if she'd already started the dissolution early, her mind retreating from the unbearable present into whatever blank space might offer refuge. Anne's laughter had stopped entirely, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. And when Clara looked at her, she saw tears running down Anne's face in steady streams, though her expression hadn't changed at all. Still blank, still empty, Clara felt something crack inside herself too, felt the last real resistance break under the weight of Tobias's words and Silas's explanations and the simple mathematical truth that 100 years of this meant it was woven into the fabric of the hollow, too deeply to be torn out. But underneath the breaking, underneath the despair, something else stirred, something that had been growing since the first marking, since the door opened in her mind. It was rage, but not the hot anger of before, not the impotent fury of a trapped animal. This was colder, sharper, more focused. If she was going to be dissolved into the mountain's dreaming, if her individuality was going to be consumed and scattered across whatever vast consciousness the sleeper possessed, then she wanted to understand it first, wanted to look directly at what was taking her and know it fully before she was taken. Maybe that was the drug talking, or maybe it was something deeper, some part of Clara that refused to go passively, even if going was inevitable. Grandmother Vess returned then, and Silas left with the journal, and the preparations continued as they had before, but something had shifted in the dynamic among the girls. They were no longer fighting together against a common enemy, because the enemy was too big to fight. They were just four separate people walking toward the same cliff edge, and whether they held hands or walked alone, the falling would be the same. That night, when Ruth took Clara back to the house, Clara didn't go to her room immediately, but stood in the main room, looking at the symbols carved into the beams, really looking at them for the first time. She could almost read them now, could almost understand what they meant. And the meanings were instructions, she realized. A manual for maintaining the pact, for ensuring the rituals stayed pure across generations. Ruth stood beside her, and Clara glanced at her cousin's broken face and asked the question she'd been afraid to ask before. When you were rejected at your choosing, what did you see? What did you understand that broke you? Ruth's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, something that might have been memory or might have been present tense trauma that never stopped happening. I saw that it was alive, Ruth said slowly, each word chosen with visible effort. The mountain, or what's under it. I saw that it wasn't just aware, it was intelligent, it was intentional, it was making choices about who to take and who to reject and why. And I saw that it rejected me not because I wasn't good enough, but because I was too good, because there was something in me it couldn't digest properly, something that would poison it if it tried to consume me. And knowing that, knowing I was toxic even to something that vast and hungry, it broke something in me, made me understand that I'm fundamentally wrong in some way I can't fix or understand. I'm still here because the mountain can't take me, but won't let me go. So I'm stuck in between, belonging nowhere, wanted by nothing, just existing because non-existence is somehow worse. She said it without emotion, without self-pity, just stating facts. And Clara understood that this was Ruth's truth, her permanent reality. And it was in some ways worse than what waited for the chosen girls, because at least they would stop existing as themselves, would merge into something else, while Ruth was condemned to remain herself forever in a self she couldn't escape. Clara climbed the stairs to her room, feeling the weight of that conversation pressing on her chest. feeling the two futures branching before her, chosen or rejected, consumed or broken, and neither offered anything resembling hope. She lay in her mother's bed and put her hand over her heart and felt it beating steady and strong. And she tried to memorize the sensation because in 2 more weeks that heartbeat would stop, or it would continue in a body that wasn't really hers anymore. And either way, Clara, as she existed now, Clara with her memories and fears and the small stubborn core of rage that refused to fully submit, that Clara would be gone. The mountain's presence pressed close around the house, and through the open door in her mind, Clara could feel it watching her, could feel its appetite not as malice but as simple hunger, the way a person might hunger for bread, neutral and inevitable and utterly without mercy. And underneath that hunger, deeper down, where the sleeper dwelled in its restless minutes away rather than hours, and she tried desperately to retreat into herself the way Lucy had but couldn't, found that the sleeper's bid had locked her firmly in her own consciousness, had ensured she would experience everything that was about to happen with perfect clarity and perfect awareness. And she understood finally that this was the true price of her mother's flight, that Sarah's escape had angered the sleeper enough that it wanted not just Clara's body, but her awareness of her body being destroyed, wanted her to suffer consciously and eternally as punishment for her mother's defiance. They reached the cabin, and Matthias opened the door, and inside Clara could see a room prepared for purposes she didn't want to understand. And as she crossed the threshold, she felt the last connection to the normal world sever, felt herself pass fully into the sleeper's domain, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never leave this place, not really, not ever. That whatever happened in the next hours would trap her forever in this moment of transition. And the worst part was that she would be aware of it, would know it was happening, would experience her own eternal consumption with perfect awful clarity. And that knowledge was the last thing she thought as Clara Whitmore before the door closed behind her and the ritual began in earnest. The cabin's interior was larger than it should have been, the walls extending into darkness that the lantern light couldn't quite penetrate. And Clara understood immediately that she wasn't in normal space anymore, that crossing the threshold had taken her somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the overlap between the waking world and the sleeper's dreaming. Matthias closed the door, and the sound echoed wrong, too long, too deep, like the door was sealing something permanent. He turned to face her, and his features flickered. Unstable, sometimes the weathered face of an old man, sometimes something else entirely, something with too many eyes and a mouth that opened in directions mouths shouldn't open. Clara tried to back away, but her body wouldn't respond, held in place by invisible threads. And she realized the preparation hadn't just opened doors in her mind, it had installed controls. It had made her body responsive to the sleeper's will rather than her own. Matthias moved closer and raised his hand to touch her face, and his fingers passed through her skin without breaking it, reaching inside her like she was made of water. And Clara felt him exploring her internal architecture, feeling the shape of her consciousness, assessing what he had to work with. "You're afraid," he said, and the voice was definitely not human now, was layered with harmonics that came from something vast, speaking through insufficient vocal cords. "Good. Fear is seasoning, makes the consumption richer, more satisfying. But you're also angry, and that's interesting. Most of the brides are broken by now, hollowed out by the preparation and resigned to dissolution. But you have something sharp still inside you, something that refuses, and I can taste it, can feel it cutting at me even now. Your mother had that same sharpness, that same refusal to accept what was inevitable. It's a Whitmore trait, apparently, that stubborn core that won't bend. It made her flight possible, but it also made her punishment necessary. And it makes you valuable in ways the other girls aren't. When I consume you, when I pull you apart and scatter your pieces through the dreaming, that sharp, refusing thing will remain, will stay coherent and aware, will fight forever against the dissolution, even though fighting is pointless. And that eternal struggle, that endless resistance, it will feed the sleeper more than 1,000 passive acceptances. You were born for this specifically, Clara. Born to be the bride who never stops being consumed, never stops experiencing the horror of it, never finds peace or oblivion or release. You are going to suffer forever, and that suffering will sustain the sleeper's dreaming. And through the sleeper it will sustain this hollow and everyone in it. You're not a sacrifice, you're a foundation stone, and every moment of your eternal agony will be the price of their prosperity. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to rage, wanted to spit at him and fight and refuse, but her body was still frozen, and her voice wouldn't work, and all she could do was stand there while Matthias circled her like a predator circling prey, his form flickering between human and other, between individual and aperture through which something vast looked out. He gestured, and Clara felt herself moving against her will, walking deeper into the cabin's impossible interior, and the walls seemed to breathe around her, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. They passed through a doorway into a second room, and Clara saw something that made the horror crystallize into perfect, awful clarity. There were others here, not bodies but presences, transparent forms that hung in the air like insects in amber, women in various states of dissolution, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or ecstasy or blank nothingness. Clara recognized Emma immediately, even though Emma had only been taken an hour ago, saw her form already coming apart at the edges, wisps of her consciousness peeling away like smoke. And Emma's eyes were open and aware and locked on Clara with desperate recognition. Beyond Emma were others, dozens of them, maybe hundreds stretching back into the darkness, all the brides from all the previous choosings. And they were all still aware, Clara realized with sick horror, all still conscious and experiencing their own consumption, all trapped in the eternal present of their dissolution. "Do you see?" Matthias asked, and there was something like satisfaction in his layered voice. "Do you understand now what was offered? Not death, not oblivion, but eternal life in the most literal sense. Every girl who was chosen, she's still here, still experiencing the moment of her transformation, still feeding the sleeper with her awareness. Time doesn't pass in the dreaming the way it passes outside. For them, it's always the night of the choosing, always the moment of consummation, always the first realization that they will never escape. Emma has been here an hour by outside time, but for her it's been subjective years already, will be subjective centuries, will be forever. And you, Clara, you're going to join them, going to hang here in the dreaming alongside all your predecessors. And unlike them, you'll remain coherent, will be able to perceive the others, will be able to understand exactly what's happening to you and to them, will be able to experience not just your own consumption, but theirs as well, will feel every moment of every bride's eternal dissolution as if it were your own. He was right beside her now, his body pressing against hers, and Clara felt him beginning to merge with her, felt his consciousness pushing into hers like a violation more profound than anything physical. And she tried to resist, tried to use that sharp, refusing thing he'd mentioned to push back. But it was like trying to stop a flood with her hands. The sleeper's presence too vast, too heavy, too inevitable. The room spun, and Clara felt herself losing coherence, felt her boundaries dissolving. And in desperation, she reached for the only thing she could think of, reached for the rage that had been growing in her since Silas first read from Tobias's journal, reached for the stubborn Whitmore refusal that had let her mother escape. And she pulled that rage around herself like armor, condensed it into something hard and sharp and impenetrable. Matthias jerked back, surprised, and for a moment his form flickered into pure otherness, a mass of angles and eyes and hungry mouths, before snapping back to something approximately human. "Interesting," the sleeper said through him, and now there was no pretense of human speech patterns, just pure alien consciousness, wearing words like an ill-fitting coat. "You're stronger than anticipated. The preparation should have stripped that resistance away, should have left you hollow and ready to be filled. But you're using the very thing we tried to remove as a weapon against us. Clever. futile. But clever. Clara felt her voice return, the sleeper's surprise loosening its control enough for her to speak, and she forced words through her frozen throat. I won't let you take me. I won't feed your hunger. I'd rather die, really die, than spend eternity as your livestock. The sleeper laughed, and the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the impossible space of the cabin. You can't die, Clara, that's the point. Death was offered to the other girls as mercy, dissolution into the collective dreaming, where their individual awareness faded over time. But you were given awareness as punishment, as the price of your mother's defiance. You belong to me now, and I will consume you slowly, carefully, eternally, and you will experience every moment of it with perfect clarity. Your resistance just makes it better, makes the flavor richer. Please keep fighting. It will make the next 1,000 years so much more satisfying. But something had shifted when Clara's rage solidified, something the sleeper hadn't anticipated. The sharp refusing thing wasn't just defense, wasn't just armor. It was a blade, and Clara could feel it cutting not inward at herself, but outward at the sleeper's presence. Could feel it severing the threads of control that bound her body. And suddenly she could move again, could step back from Matthias's flickering form. She looked at the suspended brides around her, at Emma and Lucy and Anne, whom she could now identify among the transparent forms, and she saw that they were reaching toward her, not physically, but with whatever remained of their consciousness. Like they'd been waiting for someone like Clara, someone who could still fight, someone who might be able to do what they couldn't. They're not feeding you, Clara said slowly, understanding crystallizing. They're fighting you. Every single one of them is fighting you, resisting consumption, refusing to be digested. That's why you need new brides every year, isn't it? Not because the old ones are used up, but because their resistance accumulates. Because 100 years of brides all fighting you simultaneously is weakening you, is starving you, and you need fresh awareness to overpower their collective refusal. The sleeper's laugh cut off abruptly, and Matthias's form destabilized completely, becoming pure manifestation of hunger and rage. You understand nothing. The brides are mine. Their resistance is mine. Everything they are and were and will be belongs to me. You can't free them, can't free yourself, can't do anything but delay the inevitable. The pact is sealed in blood and time and the very substance of these mountains. Break it and the hollow dies. Everyone in it dies. The sleeper's hunger unleashed without constraint. That's why your ancestors made the bargain. That's why it's held for 100 years. Sacrifice the few to save the many. That's not evil, that's mathematics. Clara felt the other brides pressing closer, felt their accumulated rage and refusal flowing into her, strengthening her, and she realized that the sleeper had made a mistake, had given her awareness not as punishment, but as connection, had linked her to every bride who'd come before and given her access to 100 years of accumulated resistance. You're dying, Clara said, and certainty filled her even as terror remained. The pact isn't sustaining you, it's slowly killing you. Every bride who fights you, who refuses to be fully consumed, she's poison in your system, and you've been swallowing poison for a century. That's why you wanted me to stay aware, isn't it? You thought my consciousness would let you control the others, would let you finally break their resistance by showing them someone fully lucid being consumed. But you miscalculated. You gave me the key to all of them, gave me access to their combined strength, and together we're stronger than you are now. Starved and weakened as you've become. The cabin shook, walls rippling like water, and Clara felt the sleeper's rage crash over her like a tsunami, felt it trying to crush her consciousness, to force her into submission through pure, overwhelming power. But the brides held her steady. 100 years of accumulated refusal, forming a foundation the sleeper couldn't erode. Matthias's form was barely human now, mostly just a hole in reality through which something vast and terrible looked out with frustrated hunger. Even if you're right, it said, voice distorting into something that wasn't quite sound. Even if I'm starving, even if the brides have weakened me, you can't escape. The cabin exists outside normal space, outside time. The consummation must complete or you remain here forever, trapped in this moment, neither consumed nor free. You can fight me, but fighting just extends your torture. Surrender, and at least it ends eventually, even if eventually is 1,000 subjective years. Clara looked at the suspended brides again, saw Emma's desperate hope and Lucy's returning awareness and Anne's fragile strength, saw all the others stretching back through the decades, and she made a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. "Then we'll all stay trapped here," she said quietly. "All 100 of us, refusing you forever, starving you completely. No more new brides, no more fresh awareness to consume. Just us, fighting you, denying you, until you finally die or we finally break, and I don't think you're going to win that war. We've been fighting you for 100 years, and we're still here, still aware, still refusing. How much longer can you last without feeding?" The sleeper's response was wordless rage. Pure, destructive fury that shattered the cabin's walls and sent Clara tumbling through darkness. But even in the tumbling, she could feel the brides holding on to her, anchoring her, and she understood that she'd won something, had found a third option between consumption and rejection, had created a stalemate that the sleeper couldn't break. The darkness lasted forever and no time at all, and when light returned, Clara found herself somewhere new, somewhere that felt like the mountain's heart, a vast cavern where something immense and ancient stirred in restless dreaming, and she knew without being told that she was seeing the sleeper's true form, not filtered through Matthias or distorted by the cabin's impossible geometry, but direct and undeniable. And the sight of it should have driven her mad, but the bride's presence kept her sane, kept her grounded, gave her the strength to look directly at what had been consuming girls for a century and see not a god, but a parasite. Something vast and old, but also desperate and hungry and ultimately vulnerable. The sleeper's true form defied comprehension. Something that existed in more dimensions than Clara's mind could process. But with the bride's collective consciousness supporting her, she could perceive its edges, could understand its nature. It wasn't a creature or a god, but something older, something that had existed before reality took its current shape. And when the world had solidified around it, the sleeper had been trapped, unable to fully manifest, unable to properly feed except through carefully constructed channels like the pact. The brides had been those channels for a century, conduits through which the sleeper pulled sustenance from the waking world. But their resistance had narrowed those channels, had starved it slowly, and now Clara could see the desperation in its massive alien awareness, could feel how close it was to genuine death, or whatever passed for death, in beings like this. The realization should have filled her with triumph, but instead Clara felt something unexpected, something that might have been pity, if pity could exist for something so vast and terrible. The sleeper was trapped just like the brides were trapped, imprisoned by the same pact that imprisoned them, unable to fully die, but unable to properly live, existing in eternal hunger that could never be satisfied, because the very act of feeding created more resistance. "You could let us go," Clara said, and her voice echoed strangely in the cavern, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. "Release the brides, break the pact, starve yourself completely and finally die. It would be mercy for you and for us." The sleeper's attention fixed on her with crushing weight, and she felt it considering, felt it testing the possibility. And for a moment she thought it might actually agree, might choose extinction over eternal frustrated hunger. But then something else pushed through the sleeper's consciousness. Something Clara recognized with horrible clarity as Tobias Whitmore's will, still embedded in the pact after 100 years, still enforcing the terms through sheer stubborn refusal to let his bargain fail. The original founders hadn't just made a deal with the sleeper. Clara realized they'd bound it with their own essences, had woven themselves into the pact's structure so thoroughly that the sleeper couldn't break it even if it wanted to, couldn't release the brides, or starve itself, or choose anything except continued existence, within the terms Tobias had established. "You see the trap," the sleeper said, and for the first time its voice carried something other than hunger, carried something that might have been despair. "Your ancestor was cleverer than he knew. He didn't just bargain with me. He imprisoned me, bound me to the hollow and the families and the endless cycle of consumption. I can't release the brides, because releasing them breaks the pact, and breaking the pact destroys the hollow, and destroying the hollow kills everyone in it. And their deaths would feed me more than 1,000 willing brides, but the terms won't allow it. Won't allow me to break free and feed properly. I'm as trapped as you are, Clara. More trapped, because you at least have the possibility of resistance. I only have hunger." Clara felt the truth of that resonate through the bride's collective awareness, felt their understanding shift as they recognized that the sleeper wasn't their true enemy, that Tobias and the pact itself were the real prison. The realization should have changed something, should have opened some new possibility, but Clara couldn't see what it was. Couldn't see how to break a binding that had been woven into the very substance of the mountains themselves. She was still trapped in the cabin's timeless space, still technically in the process of being consumed, even though the consumption had stalled, and the other brides were still suspended in their eternal dissolution, and the sleeper was still starving, and nothing Clara did seemed capable of changing any of it. "There has to be a way," she said desperately, feeling the sharp, refusing thing inside her turning frantically, trying to find an edge to cut, a weakness to exploit. "The pact was made by humans. It can be unmade by humans. If I could get back to the waking world, if I could reach the families and make them understand what they're actually doing, make them see that they're torturing the sleeper as much as the brides, maybe they'd agree to end it. To let everyone die, if that's what it takes to stop this cycle." But even as she said it, Clara knew it was impossible. Knew the families would never agree, would choose continuation over mercy every time, because that's what humans did. Held on to life regardless of the cost, regardless of who paid it. The sleeper shifted, and Clara felt something like respect flow through its vast awareness. "You would choose extinction," it said wonderingly. "Would accept death for yourself and everyone in the hollow if it meant ending the suffering. That's rarer than you know, that willingness to let go. Most humans cling to existence with desperate strength, accept any terms, make any bargain, sacrifice anyone to keep living just a little longer. But you're different. You have your mother's strength and something else besides, something that lets you see beyond yourself. If you could reach the waking world, if you could somehow convince the families to break the pact voluntarily, then yes, it would end. The hollow would die, the sleeper would die, the brides would finally be released into true death. Everything would end, cleanly and completely. And that would be mercy. The cavern shuddered, and Clara felt reality fracture around her. Felt the sleeper using the last of its strength to do something, to create a possibility where none had existed before. The darkness split, and Clara saw an opening. A crack in the cabin's timeless space that led back to the waking world, narrow and unstable but present. "I'm giving you a chance," the sleeper said, and its voice was fading now, growing distant. "Sending you back costs me more than you can imagine, weakens me further. But if there's any possibility of ending this, then I'll spend what little I have left to create it. Go, Clara, return to the hollow. Tell them what you've learned. Make them choose. Make them decide between prosperity bought with eternal torture and death bought with mercy. And if they refuse, if they choose continuation, then come back here and we'll continue the stalemate, you and the brides and I, locked in eternal struggle until something finally breaks." Clara didn't hesitate, didn't question, just ran for the opening before it could close, and she felt the bride's presence retreating as she moved. Felt them staying behind in their suspension because they couldn't leave, could only wait and hope that Clara succeeded where they'd all failed. The crack in reality swallowed her, and she was tumbling through darkness again. But different darkness this time, lighter somehow, less oppressive. And then she was gasping on cold ground under open sky, and the October moon was still high overhead, which meant no time had passed in the waking world. The entire confrontation with the sleeper compressed into a single moment outside. Clara dragged herself to her feet and realized she was at the choosing ground, could see the platform still standing, and the family still gathered, though they looked confused now, disturbed, like something had gone wrong with the ritual. She saw Silas standing with the other family heads, saw Ruth at the edge of the crowd with her broken face, showing something that might have been hope. And Clara stumbled forward into the torchlight, and every eye turned to her. "It's over," Clara said, and her voice was hoarse but strong, carrying across the clearing. "The pact, the choosing, all of it. I've seen what the sleeper is, what we've been doing to it, and what it's been doing to the brides, and it has to end. We have to break the pact, have to let the hollow die, have to choose mercy over prosperity. I know you won't want to, I know you'll fight me, but I've seen the alternative, and it's worse than death. It's torture eternal for everyone involved, and I won't let it continue." Silas stared at her with his pale, empty eyes, and slowly something like understanding crossed his weathered face. "You escaped," he said wonderingly. "Actually escaped the consummation, came back from the dreaming. That shouldn't be possible, the pact doesn't allow for it. But here you stand." He looked at the other family heads, and Clara saw them exchanging glances, saw calculation moving behind their faces, and she realized with sinking dread that they weren't going to listen, weren't going to choose mercy. Were already planning how to recapture her and force the completion of the ritual. "She's contaminated," one of them said. "Might have been Crane or Blackwood. Clara couldn't tell. Touched by the sleeper but not consumed. That makes her dangerous, unpredictable. We need to finish the choosing. Properly need to send her back to the cabin and ensure the consummation completes." They moved toward her, and Clara backed away, looking desperately for Ruth, for anyone who might help. But the families were united in their determination to preserve the pact, to maintain the system that had sustained them for a century, regardless of the cost. Clara turned to run, but the men were faster, hands grabbing her arms, dragging her back toward the southern path. And she screamed not for help, because there was no help, but simply to make noise. To protest, to refuse one final time, even though refusal seemed pointless. And then Ruth was there, stepping between Clara and the men, her broken face set in an expression Clara had never seen before. "Something like determination." "No," Ruth said simply, and the word carried weight that stopped the men in their tracks. "I was rejected by the sleeper 3 years ago, rejected because there's something wrong in me that even that hungry thing couldn't digest. But maybe that wrongness has a purpose. Maybe I was saved for this specific moment." She turned to Clara, and there was something almost sane in her pale eyes now. Something that looked like the person she might have been before the rejection broke her. "You can't convince them to break the pact, Clara. They'll never choose death over survival, never choose mercy over prosperity. But I can break it from the inside. Because I'm part of the system but also outside it, rejected but not released. And that makes me a loophole the founders never anticipated." Before anyone could stop her, Ruth pulled a knife from somewhere in her dress and drew it across her own throat, deep and vicious, and as her blood poured out onto the choosing ground, Clara felt something fundamental crack, felt the pact shudder and fracture, felt Tobias Whitmore's binding losing coherence as Ruth's contaminated blood poisoned it from within. The family screamed and surged forward, but it was too late. Ruth was falling, and the pact was breaking, and Clara felt the cabin's timeless space collapse, felt the brides suddenly released from their suspension, felt them scatter like smoke as the sleeper's hold on them dissolved. And underneath it all, she felt the sleeper itself beginning to die, finally and completely, its sustenance cut off and its prison crumbling. The ground shook and trees began to fall, and Clara understood that the hollow was dying too, the prosperity bought with blood finally being revoked, and the families scattered in panic as their homes began to collapse in the distance. Clara knelt beside Ruth and cradled her cousin's head. watched the light fade from those pale, broken eyes, and Ruth smiled, actually smiled with something like peace. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, blood on her lips. "Thank you for giving me a purpose, for making my wrongness mean something." Then she was gone, truly gone, and Clara felt her death ripple through the breaking pact and accelerate the sleepers' dissolution. The families were fleeing now, running toward the paths that led out of the hollow. But Clara could hear trees falling across those paths, could hear the mountain itself coming apart as the sleepers' presence unwove from it. And she knew that none of them would escape, that the hollow would claim everyone who'd benefited from the pact, would exact its final price in wholesale death. Clara should have run too, but she stayed with Ruth's body, stayed in the choosing ground that was now just a clearing like any other clearing. And she felt the bride's presences one final time as they passed through toward whatever came after. Felt Emma and Lucy and Anne and all the others finally free, finally released into true death, and their gratitude washed over her like warm rain. The mountain collapsed slowly, taking hours or days or moments, Clara couldn't tell. And when silence finally returned, she was alone in a hollow that was no longer a hollow, but just a devastated valley where nothing would grow again for 100 years. Alone, except for Ruth's body and the October moon, and the complete and utter absence of the sleepers' hungry attention. The pact was broken, the families were dead, the brides were free, and Clara had survived somehow, had been spared by chance or design, or simply because the mountain didn't have the energy left to claim her too. Clara buried Ruth in the graveyard among all the other brides, giving her cousin a place among the girls she'd tried to become but couldn't. And she stayed in the ruined hollow for 3 days, waiting for rescue that never came, because no one knew the hollow had existed or that it had died. On the 4th day, she walked out following the path she'd arrived on, and it took her a week to reach civilization, staggering into Lexington filthy and exhausted and alone. She told the authorities nothing coherent, just that there'd been an accident in the mountains, that everyone was dead, and they sent men to investigate, but the men never found anything. No hollow, no homes, no bodies, just forest growing thick and impassable. Clara was placed in an orphanage because she had no family left, no home to return to, and the county officials who'd sent her to Silas in the first place looked at her with confusion, like they couldn't quite remember why they'd done it. Like the pact's dissolution had erased even the memory of its existence from everyone except Clara. She adapted, grew older, eventually married a kind man who never asked about her past, bore children who knew nothing of mountains that hungered or girls who were consumed. The years passed normally, without supernatural incident, without horror, and Clara convinced herself that it had ended, that the sleeper was truly dead, and the pact truly broken, and the nightmare was over. She lived to be 73 years old, surrounded by grandchildren in a house far from any mountains. And when death came for her naturally, she went peacefully, without fear, grateful for the ordinary life she'd been given. But death wasn't ending, wasn't darkness and silence and nothingness like Clara had expected. Instead, she woke in a familiar room, the cabin's impossible interior, and around her hung the brides in their eternal suspension. And standing before her was Matthias wearing his flickering form, and the sleeper's presence pressed close with hungry satisfaction. "Did you think you escaped?" the sleeper asked, and its voice was stronger now, fully fed in ways Clara didn't understand. "Did you think the pact could actually be broken? Oh, Clara, sweet, stubborn Clara. The entire confrontation was the ritual, was the consummation itself. Your resistance, your escape, Ruth's sacrifice, the pact's dissolution, the Hollow's death, all of it was part of the preparation. The most elaborate preparation ever conducted, designed to create something unique. A bride who genuinely believed she'd won, who lived a full, natural life thinking she was free, accumulating decades of peace and normalcy and satisfaction, all of which you brought with you when you finally died. And now I consume not just your fear and pain, but also your hope, your triumph, your 73 years of thinking you'd beaten me. That's the feast I've been preparing for a century. Clara, not your terror but your relief, not your suffering but your joy. All of it inverted and devoured and converted into sustenance richer than 1,000 conventional brides. Clara felt her consciousness fracturing as understanding hit, felt the sharp refusing thing inside her finally break under the weight of the sleeper's revelation. And she looked at the suspended brides around her and saw not their past selves, but their future selves. Saw Emma and Lucy and Anne and all the others who'd also been given escape, who'd also lived normal lives, who'd also died thinking they were free, only to wake here in the eternal moment of consumption. The families, Clara whispered. The hollow, all those people, they died, I saw them die. The sleeper laughed and gestured, and Clara saw through the cabin's walls into the waking world, and there was the hollow, intact and prosperous, people moving through their days. And among them she recognized faces from the choosing night. Silas and the other family heads, all alive, all continuing exactly as they had for a century. They never died. The hollow never collapsed. That was all part of your preparation, your personal ritual, the story you needed to believe to fully ripen. Everyone who goes through the choosing experiences it differently, lives through their own unique escape narrative. But they all end here, in this eternal moment, bringing with them their accumulated years of false hope to feed the dreaming. You didn't break anything, Clara. You were always already broken, already mine, already consumed. You just didn't realize it until now. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to fight, wanted to find that sharp, refusing thing and use it one final time. But it was gone, dissolved by the revelation. And she felt herself beginning to dissolve too, felt her boundaries losing coherence, felt the sleeper pulling her apart and scattering her. Pieces through the dreaming. And the worst part was that she could feel the brides around her experiencing the same revelation, each of them learning simultaneously that their escapes had been false, their lives illusions, their freedom just another layer of the preparation. Welcome home, the sleeper said. And Matthias leaned forward and kissed Clara's forehead. And the kiss was freezing and burning and eternal. And Clara felt herself becoming transparent, becoming suspended like the others, hanging in the cabin's timeless space alongside Emma and Lucy and Anne and her mother Sarah and Mercy Whitmore from 1740 and hundreds of others stretching forward into futures. Clara could now perceive brides not yet born who would go through their own elaborate preparations, their own false escapes, their own revelations, all of them feeding the sleeper's hunger forever and ever and ever. And the last thing Clara thought before her individual awareness finally scattered completely was that the sleeper had been right about everything, that there was no escape and no death and no mercy, just eternal consumption experienced across infinite subjective time. And the mountains never forgot, and debts were always collected, and some hungers could never be satisfied, only perpetually fed. And she was feeding it now, would always be feeding it, was feeding it yesterday and today and tomorrow simultaneously, existed forever in the moment of her dissolution, aware and terrified and consumed and consuming, trapped in the choosing that never ended, the bride who never stopped being unmade, the girl who thought she won but had been losing since before she was born. Since the moment Tobias Whitmore made his bargain and sealed all his descendants into the dreaming's appetite, and the October moon rose over the hollow, year after year after year after year, unchanging and eternal, watching the choosing repeat and repeat and repeat. Different girls, same fate forever.